Well, shalom, my friends, and welcome to our Genesis Bible study. Today we're going to be in chapter 35, and kind of a lot of things going on. This is sort of a turning point in the book of Genesis, so my PowerPoint's going to change a lot after this video. I will mention at this point, too, that when we do chapter 36, I do plan to make a video on that chapter. It's the genealogy of Esau's family. And basically what it is just a long laundry list of Middle Eastern names associated with Esau's family. Because Esau is an important player in the biblical story, and so his family's genealogy is provided in the Bible. But there is next to no narrative there and not much of interest. I am committed to doing every chapter and verse of a Bible study when I do it. And I'm really not interested in digging up the meaning and significance of the names that are listed there. So chapter 36, I think, is going to be a very short video, but I do plan to have one. Meanwhile, for chapter 35, I am going to go through the PowerPoint that we've been doing in recent chapters. So it's going to be a lot of review for people who have already been through it once or more times. But for those who are turning into this video without the background material, I do think I will go through it. If you'd prefer not to do the background PowerPoint material, I just encourage you at this point to fast forward until you get to the Bible software program where you see the verses of the Bible, and wait for us there as I go through our PowerPoint material. I have lately been advertising a book that I recently had published. It's called Nazarene Essene Theology. It's basically a systematic theology from Genesis to Revelation. This book has just about everything I think I know about the Bible recorded there. And because the book of Genesis plays such a significant role in the biblical story, the theology of the Bible, there's a lot of material in Genesis. So you might benefit by that if you'd like to get this book. It's available on Amazon. That's where I would recommend that you try to find it. We've also been looking at dispensational charts, which are charts that kind of divide the biblical story up into particular eras of time. And with each era, there is kind of a unique stewardship that God assigns to mankind. So let me see if I can rattle off the dispensations. And these are the standard dispensational theology time periods. The first one is innocence. Then we have conscience. Then we have human government. Then we have promise, the age that we are currently studying. Then we have the age of the law. Then we have the age of grace, the age that we are all currently living in. Some people also call that the church age, which is appropriate. Then we have the kingdom age, which is talking about the millennial kingdom, the 1,000-year kingdom, where Yeshua, Jesus, rules on a throne from Jerusalem as king of the whole world. And then we have the new heavens and the new earth, which is basically the eternal perfect state and all of the amazing things that God does there. So the chart that we're studying now in association with chapter 35 is the age of promise. Now, the Bible from Genesis to Revelation is absolutely chock full of God's promises. He makes them all over the place in all the dispensations. But I think, as you can see from our studies of the patriarchs, Avraham, Yitzhak, and Yaakov, whose name is changed to Israel, the promises that he makes in this period of time are tremendously significant. And that's why it's called the Age of Promise. And I only say that just because I don't want you to get the idea that God made all of the promises he ever had made or will make in this dispensation. That is not correct. And I mean, the same could be said of the other dispensations. The dispensation of conscience is significant because God begins to talk to people through the conscience, the so-called still small voice. But he does that in all of the dispensations after that. Conscience is significant because in the age of innocence, God spoke with people face to face. And then once they sinned, he could no longer do that because his holiness would destroy sinful human beings. So he switches to speaking to people in the still small voice and so forth. So this is the dispensation that we are in now. And the main characters are Avram, whose name is changed by God to Avraham, Yitzhak, who doesn't experience a name change. And we also study a little bit about his brother Esav or Esau. And then Yaakov is the third generation of the patriarchs, and his name is changed to Israel, which means like a victorious prince in Israel. And this will later become the name of the nation that is formed. Um, Avram and Yitzhak had few children because their wives were barren. Now, one of Jacob's wives, Rachel, was barren for a long time, but today in chapter 35, she's going to have another child. So she has two children. And of course, when Yaakov got married, he ended up with four women, two actual wives, and then each one of those wives had a servant girl. And we'll talk about them later and all the children that they have. But here the sons are listed. There are 12 sons listed here. Levi is significant because it was this tribe, based on the patriarch Levi, that became the church workers, if you will, the priests in the temple and their assistants, their associate ministers in the temple, the Levites, who, did everything from singing the choir to assisting with the sacrifices, a lot of cleanup, a lot of organizational and logistical kind of stuff. Then there's Judah, who's is one of the sons, and the tribe that's named after him will be the tribe of nobility. All the kings, I shouldn't say all of the kings. The first king, Saul, came from the tribe of Benjamin, but all of the other tribes after David came from the tribe of Judah. And that includes our Lord Jesus Christ. It includes Yeshua HaMashiach, was born of the tribe of Judah. And according to God's promises made to this tribe and to King David, all of the legitimate, God-pleasing kings will come from this tribe. And then another person who plays a very important role is Joseph, who is Rachel's oldest. Rachel is Jacob's favorite wife, and Joseph, because he's her eldest son, becomes Jacob's favorite son. And as you can imagine, that doesn't go over very well with all of these other sons in the family. I also like to mention this red ribbon of salvation or redemption that runs through the patriarchs, through Judah, because the Messiah will come out of that tribe. It runs down into Egypt, and then we will encounter Moses during the Exodus. And that red ribbon continues throughout all of these charts. I think this is the last chart that we will be looking at in this Bible study, because the next chart is the age of the law, and Moses is the central figure there. So I think that's enough about the chart. We have maps that show the travels of the patriarchs. This one is the travels of Abraham. And God promised Abraham, and then later Isaac, and then Jacob, that all of the land that they saw with their eyes and walked on with their feet would be given to them as the promised land. So you can see from this map that it's a pretty large piece of territory. The significant Bible passages as far as the boundaries or the extent of land in the promised land are Genesis 13, beginning at verse 14, and Genesis 15, beginning at verse 18. So read through those if you're interested. I've also included this map, which shows a journey that Abraham and Sarah took from the land of Canaan over into Egypt during a time of famine. And this is probably the kind of the location where they would have stayed at that time, because they met with the king of Egypt there, the Pharaoh there. And you can see that their travels extended to the river of Egypt on the west. That's the Nile River. And then, of course, the other boundary on the east is the Euphrates River, which kind of forms the northern and eastern boundaries of the Promised Land. It makes up most of the Middle East. We have this map that we have looked at, and for Jacob's travels, after Jacob cheats his, well, I shouldn't say cheats, because of something else we'll talk about in a few minutes. Jacob ends up with his brother's birthright and blessing from his father. And he does so not necessarily with Esau's willing contribution of these things. And so there is some hostility between Jacob and his brother Esau. And because of that, in order to stay alive, Jacob will travel up here to Haran, which is where it's the extended family estate of this family. One of the things that we're going to learn in our text for today, or just be reminded of in our text for today, is that the extended family up here in Haran, which is modern day Syria, in those days it was called Padan Aram, which is kind of a reference to the Fertile Crescent, the land between the Tigris and Euphrates rivers. So this is where the largest part of the family settled down after Abraham and Sarah left. The benefit of extended family is because all the different generations could marry into the extended family and maintain that family relationship, because it was this family, the family of Abraham and Sarah, then Isaac and Jacob and his sons, that God blessed. He blessed the family. So it was good for the spouses to be within that, under the umbrella of that family blessing. But one of the disadvantages was that the extended family up here was involved in pagan worship, false religion with idols and stuff like that. Now, when we come to the law, when we come to the Ten Commandments and the law of Moses, we're going to find that idolatry, having images and idols, is strictly forbidden by God. And it's one of the things that offends him the most, because he is the one true God and he wants to be worshiped in that fashion. So there'll be a little allusion to that in our study for today. This is just a blown up map. This is like the red square here. So this is just a kind of a larger scale version of the same map. And I want to point out a few significant places on the map. One of those is Mahanaim. Here's the name of the place, and it's right on the Yavok River, the Jabbok River. And that is where Yaakov, in a previous chapter, had a wrestling match with God. And he won the wrestling match, but he got his hip put out of the socket. But the best thing he got out of that was a blessing, which we'll talk about further today. This is when Jacob was just returning to the Promised Land, and he was about to have an encounter with Esau. The red arrow is Esau going to meet Yaakov, his brother. Yaakov was afraid that Esav was going to kill him, because the last thing he had heard from Esav when he left Canaan was that his brother was intent on killing him. So he's still fearful of that. Their meeting goes very well, and they treat each other very kindly. In fact, Esau even invites him to come down and live with him, bring his family down to Mount Seir, which was his territory. And Yaakov was reluctant to do that. So instead of going to Mount Seir, Yaakov goes over here to Shechem or Shechem. And in the last chapter that we studied, chapter 34, that's where Dinah or Dinah, the daughter of Yaakov, the only one that's mentioned, I think, she was raped by a guy named Shechem, and his father was Hamor. And Dinah gets raped, but Shechem is in love with her. He wants to marry her. So, there is this, it's almost like an ambush. Uh, Jacob's sons tell Hamor and Shechem that the only way they could possibly have marriages between their families is if all the men of Shechem would allow themselves to be circumcised, because all the Jewish guys, the Hebrews, were all circumcised. And that was important to them and to their religious belief. It was a sign of their covenant. So I guess Shechem was influential enough that all of the men of Shechem get circumcised probably at the same time. And while they are healing up, Levi and who else was it? Shimon, I believe, Simeon, are the two brothers that lead an attack on the city, and they kill everybody. Kill everybody there. They get their daughter or their sister Dinah back with the family. But when Yaakov hears about that, he is afraid that this has, in his own words, he's become a stench in the nostrils of the people who live in this whole vicinity around Shechem. So Jacob is going to have to leave town, and that's what we're going to read about today. Some of the different places that he will visit. One of the first places on his itinerary is to go back here to Beth El, which the Canaanites called Luz. Jacob calls it Beth El because Beth means house and El is a shortened form of Elohim, the word for God. So Jacob calls it the house of God. Now, when Jacob left Canaan to flee from his brother, he stopped by Bethel, and God appeared to him there and blessed him. And Jacob built an altar there. Then he was gone up in Haran for 20 years. Well, now he's come back to Bethel. So we'll see what happens there. And I will just point out that Bethel is I think this is about like 10 miles or something like that. Bethel is about 10 miles north of Jerusalem. Another place that will come into our study today is the city of Bethlehem. I don't think it was probably called that by the Canaanites at that time. It may have been, but another word for it is Ephratah, Ephratah, which is Hebrew for like a fruitful place, a fruitful place. Ephratah may be a northern suburb of Bethlehem, and I'll point out why that is. But these are the significant places on the map. Just kind of keep those in mind as we go through the study today. I'm not going to spend a little bit of time on this, but I came across in Genesis 25:27 the fact that Yaakov is called a Tam, which doesn't seem like a big deal at first, but it is. That Hebrew word describes him as a morally pious person, complete. Perfect is like another Hebrew word that's used for that. Gentle, dear, undefiled, upright, all those things seem to defy the way the Bible describes Jacob. And I got to wondering if this characterizing Jacob as kind of a dirty rat is maybe a misreading of the Hebrew. I'm not so sure that it is. He still does some very questionable things. But I tried to put a construction on those behaviors of Jacob that would still allow him to be a morally pious, perfect, undefiled, and upright man. So I've either done a good job of that or not so good job of that. I'll let you be the judge of it. But we will soon be departing this characteristic of Jacob and turning to other things. This is the family tree of Abraham. We have Abraham's father, Terah, and then the three sons, Haran, Nahor, and Avram. Haran died, I think it was even before they arrived in Haran. Haran is a place name, and here we have Haran. They're spelled differently. I know they sound alike, but they're spelled different. So here we have the wives and the concubines of all the different generations. Rivka comes from Nahor and Bethel, and her brother is Laban. His daughters are Leah and Rachel, and Yaakov marries both of them and gets their maidservants, Bilhah and Zilpah, in the deal as well. Then we come to the four women in Yaakov's life. We have Leah, who's the oldest and how shall I say this, the less attractive one. She's the one he ends up marrying first, but not because he wanted her first. He just wanted Rachel. And then Leah's servant is Zilpah. Then Rachel is the one, the pretty one that he fell in love with. And Rachel had a maidservant also named Bilhah. The problem initially was that Rachel was barren and couldn't have nearly as many children as her older sister. So Leah gives birth to Reuben, the oldest, then Shimon, Levi. These are the guys who destroyed Shechem, and they are brothers by the same mother. Then Yehuda is the royal family, Issachar and Zvulun. Then Leah's maidservant Zilpah had Gad and Asher. Gad means a troop. It's not. I know it's pronounced God, but it doesn't have anything to do with divinity. Then Rachel is barren for the longest period of time. So we'll look at Bilhah, the servant girl's sons, and they are Dan and Naphtali. And then eventually God blesses Rachel so she can conceive. She gives birth to Yosef and Benjamin. Benjamin will be born in our study today. This picture shows Yosef in his coat of many colors, which probably in the Hebrew just means like a long sleeve coat. But it was something that marked him as his father's favorite son and put him at odds with all of his other brothers. We've got this section about four proofs that Yaakov took his wives immediately and like didn't have to wait 14 years to be married to his favorite wife. He took both of those girls immediately, and of course the maidservants were on board. I don't want to read through this today, so I'm just going to pause. If you want to read this stuff, pause the tape now. And then when you're through reading, hit play. Here's the second screen for this stuff, and I'll move my picture out of the way so you can read it. So pause now, and then when you're finished reading, hit play again. And here is the third screen. I need to move my picture even more. And when you're through reading that, just hit play again. Okay. Today, I do want to discuss a little bit the divine appearances to Jacob, because there were three of them, I believe, that the Bible mentions. God appeared to Jacob and confirmed the Abrahamic covenant, which consisted of land, it consisted of children, and a blessing that Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob would receive to themselves and their families, but also would share with all the nations of the world. And what that shared blessing is talking about is that the Messiah would come through this family, and the Messiah, Yeshua, he will be the savior of the world. So by believing in him, people who are not of this chosen family can be blessed by forgiveness of sins, a new birth, being born again, and being in a relationship with God and having eternal life. So Genesis 28 is where Jacob first received the Abrahamic covenant to himself. It went to Jacob and not to his brother Esau. Then in the next appearance, that happened when they were encamped at Machanaim, and God wrestled with Jacob bodily, and that was in chapter 32. This was a bodily appearance of God, as is proven by the 30th verse there. I mean, there was physical contact between the two. It was not a dream or a vision. And, Jacob confirms that by saying, I've seen God face to face and my life is preserved. Now, he didn't see the full glory of God because that would have destroyed him. Sometimes this appearance of God is depicted as an angel. That's a possibility. And we know it's an angel in those pictures because the angels usually have wings. Angels do have wings, but they don't always manifest physically with wings. So it could have been an angel of the Lord, but I'm going to stick with the idea that this was God himself. Probably what is called a Christophany, or like a pre-incarnation, pre-birth in Bethlehem appearance of Yeshua in human flesh. And then the third visitation or appearance is the one we're going to encounter today, and that is where Yaakov experienced another visible manifestation of God in chapter 35, verses 9 through 15. And he says, and God appeared, the Bible says, and God appeared unto Yaakov again. Now, I have already spoiled the spoiler alert. Today we are going to experience the death of Rachel. Rachel has already given birth to Yosef. She did that while they were still living up in Haran, in Padan Aram. And today she's going to give birth to her second son and last. And she's going to die in childbirth. That's going to take place in a place called Ephratah, which I believe is like a northern suburb of Bethlehem. And even in those days, Bethlehem was a small town. But, there was a place called Ephratah on the northern outskirts of that little town. And here is a picture of her tomb. I don't know the antiquity of this building, but the Hebrew on the sign says kavar, which is the Hebrew word for tomb or grave of Rachel. That's how Rachel's name is spelled. Of course, you could see a menorah up here on the top of this building. Some of the photos you will see of this building do not have the menorah on top. It has a domed structure here, which I'm sure was built much later on. But the Kavar Rachel is in Palestinian territory. So it's about Bethlehem is about 5 miles south of Jerusalem. Jerusalem used to be a divided city. Israel controls the whole thing now, but there's a lot of hostility there. So if you go south of Jerusalem, you're into Palestinian territories. You're into what is called the West Bank of the Jordan River. Jews call it Judea and Samaria. Palestinians call it the West Bank, and both groups lay claim to it. In my opinion, the Jewish people and the country of Israel have the best claim to it, certainly the best biblical claim to it. But that's a little off the subject today. So there's a picture of Rachel's tomb. And in our study for today, Isaac, Yitzhak, the second generation of the patriarchs, is also going to pass away at a very old age. This is the city of Hebron, and this building in the central focus of the picture here is called the Tomb of the Patriarchs. So we know Abraham is buried there, Sarah's buried there, Isaac is going to be buried there. A little bit of a question about where Yaakov is going to be buried. And we'll talk about that when we get to it. But this is the Tomb of the Patriarchs. It's also called the Cave of Machpelah. And then obviously it started out as a cave, and then there was a building built over the top of the cave. If you go on the internet, there are some inside pictures of that also. Hebron is even south of Bethlehem, maybe, I don't know, maybe another 10 miles south of Bethlehem. Also in Palestinian territory. And so it's hard to get there. I had in all my 6 trips to Israel, I don't think I've ever been to Hebron. I have been to Bethlehem, but it's an ordeal for Jews or Christians to get into Bethlehem today. On the last several trips, when we went to Bethlehem, our guide, who was a Messianic Jew, would not go into Bethlehem because he might not have come out of there alive. So Jewish people are not welcome in Bethlehem or points further south, Hebron. So it's kind of a sad state of affairs. So those are the 2 burial spots. And that will allow us to go ahead and begin our textual study. So here we go. Genesis 35, verse 1. Then Elohim said to Yaakov, arise and go up to Bethel and dwell there and make an altar there to God, who appeared to you when you fled from the face of Esau, your brother. So remember, Bethel is a bit west of Mahanaim, where Yaakov wrestled with God. It's a bit south of Shechem, where the sons of Yaakov killed everybody in the city. Well, they killed all the men in the city. I guess they took the women as what? What would they be like? Captives or I don't know, slaves or something like that to the family and the children also. So they didn't kill everybody. But then they had to leave town after this massacre. And by the way, Yaakov was not on board with that. So when the massacre happened, Yaakov was very upset about that. He was scared for his safety, reasonably so. But he needs to get out of there. So God tells him to arise and go to Bethel and dwell there. And it makes he's also commanded to build an altar there. And then there's a reference made to the previous visit to Bethel when he fled from his brother Esau. And he built an altar there at that time also. So history is going to kind of repeat itself at this later stage in history. And this is more than 20 years later. In fact, it may be way more than 20 years after the 2 visits to Bethel. And Yaakov said to his household and to all who were with him, and this is before they actually departed for Bethel. He said to them, put away the foreign gods that are among you. And these would be these little statues. Let's say Nekar in Hebrew means foreign or strange, and then Elohe, Hanekar, is talking about foreign gods. And the New King James, appropriately so, spells gods here with a small g, meaning they're not actual gods. There's only one true God. But the Canaanites would have called these gods legitimate gods. They would have spelled it with a capital G. We spell it with a small g. So he says, put away the foreign gods that are among you and purify yourselves and change your garments. Now, I mentioned earlier that up in Haran at the family estate, the extended family estate up there, they were practicing idolatry up there. And we know that because when Yaakov and his family decided to leave from Haran, Rachel, the pretty one, his favorite wife, stole some idols or images from her father. They're called Terebinth or something like that. Terabim, maybe. Anyway, those are references to these like small metal or wood idols that people used in false worship. And Rachel stole some of those and took them south with her. So apparently, some of these idols are still in the family. And Yaakov knows that he's going to go to a place where God has appeared to him before, and God is going to appear to him again. And he wants to get all of the stuff that's offensive to God out of the family. So he says, get rid of your foreign gods and purify yourselves and change your garments. The purifying is usually done by washing in water. So it's an outward washing or cleansing that signifies an internal cleansing of the soul and spirit. Then he says, let us arise and go up to Bethel. Now, actually, he's going to be traveling south, but whenever you go to meet God, you always go up. And Bethel is in the mountains of Israel. So it's a higher, probably a higher elevation, but not necessarily so. So, in other words, let's arise and go up to Bethel. Whenever you go to meet God, no matter what compass direction you're going, you go up. The city of Jerusalem is the city that God would later choose as a place for his temple and to meet with his people. And again, I mean, no matter what compass direction you come from, see, normally if we were coming from the north and going to Jerusalem, we would say we're going down because south is downward on our maps, I guess. But if you're going to meet God, you always go up. And Jerusalem too is, it's on a mountain, so it's high up there. But the going up is a reference to meeting with God. There I'll make an altar to God who answered me in the day of my distress. He's talking about when he was fleeing from Esau for his life in the day of my distress and has been with me in the way which I've gone. And in our studies, we've seen that. Ever since Yaakov left home and met with God in Bethel, the agreement was that God would be with him and be his God, and he would prosper and bless him. And Yaakov says, well, if you're going to do that, then I definitely want to worship you and believe in you and, trust you for everything I need. So that's the agreement. It's kind of a covenant agreement that they have. And yeah, has been with me in the way which I have gone. When he was up there living in Laban's household and working for his father-in-law, God blessed him in such extraordinary ways that Laban's family kind of got jealous of Jacob, tried to cheat him a few times and things like that because God had prospered him so greatly. Verse 4, so they gave Yaakov all the foreign gods which were in their hands. Again, like small images or idols, carved images and stuff. And the earrings which were in their ears. Now, I don't know of anything the Bible says that is bad about earrings. And by the way, Nezim is usually a reference to nose rings. So some kind of rings, either on the ears or on the nose. Nose rings are popular today. So, Christians aren't as scandalized by the idea of nose rings as they used to be. One of my daughters wears a nose ring, which I'm not fond of just because of my generation, I guess. I don't like all kinds of metal hanging from my daughter's faces, but my daughter is so beautiful that she makes that nose ring look beautiful. Okay, so they gave their earrings, which were in their ears, and Yaakov hid them. Let's see, Taman, to hide, it just says. I get the impression that like he dug a hole and kind of buried them, but I don't get it from this word. I'm not sure the extended meanings of this word taman. So he hid them under the terebinth tree, which was by Shechem. Terebinth is a word I'm not familiar with. The Hebrew word is elah, and in other translations, it's called an oak tree, which I'm very familiar with. I own some forest property, some woodland property that is populated mostly by oak trees. So he buried it under an oak tree, which was by Shechem. So I imagine he dug a hole at the foot of, at the base of this tree, put all that crap in the hole and buried him over. And they journeyed. They took a nasa, a journey, which literally means to pull up tent stakes. And that's probably literally what they did. They were probably living in tents. That's why they can move around so easily. It's kind of like the old television show MASH, a mobile army surgical hospital. So it was a actual hospital that operated in tents, so they could move it from place to place, depending on where the battle lines were. Well, that's how shepherds live. They live like Bedouins. They stay in one place until the pasture lands will no longer meet their needs, and then they move somewhere else. Or they kill a bunch of people and they have to run for their lives. So they pull up tent stakes and they journeyed. And the terror of God, the chita, the terror of God was upon the cities that were all around them, and they did not pursue the sons of Jacob. So why would the people be so afraid? Well, let's look at one practical reason, which is not the ultimate thing here. And that is the fact that the news probably would have spread pretty quickly that the sons of Yaakov had, I'm trying to carefully pick my terms here, massacred the population of Shechem, the city of Shechem. So that news gets around, and all of these probably less populated places that they would be passing through, the people are probably going, better not mess with the sons of Yaakov, or we'll all end up dead like the people of Shechem did. So that would be one reason why they were afraid. But our text tells us that it was the terror of God, that they were afraid of God. So why would they be, why would they be that afraid? Well, for one thing is they may have been very much aware of how God had prospered the families of Abraham, Isaac, and Yaakov, and now the sons of Yaakov. God is prospering them, which shows a clear choice of God over that family. And he's blessing them in such extraordinary ways. They may have even been familiar with the Abrahamic promise that those who cursed Yaakov would be cursed. I'm sorry, cursed Abraham, Isaac, and Yaakov and their extended family. Those who curse them will be cursed. Those who bless them will be blessed. So they might bless the family of Yaakov out of fear of, coming under the curse of God. People who lived in Canaan were very religious. So I guess you could say they had that going for them. The problem was it was false religions, and some of it was absolutely diabolical. Some of the false religious practices were not only immoral, but just an abomination. And later, God will punish them for the manifestations of these false religions. So anyway, as they're traveling to their destination of Bethel, people are trembling in fear as they pass by, legitimately afraid of the family because of the violence that has just occurred, but even more so afraid in the sense of reverence, but also of just fear and trembling and shaking in your boots because God was so obviously with them. So verse 6, so Yaakov came to Luz, which is the Canaanite name for this place. That is Bethel. Bethel is Hebrew, so I'm thinking, well, in fact, the Bible tells us that Jacob named the place Bethel because that's where God had met him. It was the house of God, which is in the land of Canaan, and he and all the people who were with him. He and all the people who were with him came to Bethel, is what this is saying, or Luz by the other name. Then verse 7, and he, Yaakov, built an altar there, a Mizbeach. The Hebrew word is highlighted in our Hebrew section there. The last three consonants reading from right to left are Zavach, And that is a sacrifice, like an animal, specifically an animal sacrifice. And then a place um, that where these sacrifices take place is called a mizbeach. You just add an M to the beginning of this word to zavak, and you get a mizbeach. So an altar is where zavaks take place. A mizbeach is where zavaks take place. And there he called the name of the place Beth El, because there God appeared to him when he fled from the face of his brothers. So he had already called it Bethel. It sounds like he kind of dedicates the area, the city of Bethel, there again, and he builds an altar there to worship his God, the one true God. Now it says Devorah or Deborah, Rivka's nurse. So there's another Deborah in the Bible, and she is a judge in the book of Judges. So that takes place after the Exodus, maybe a generation or two after the Exodus and the conquest of the land. And Deborah is a heroine or a female hero in the book of Judges. This is a different Devorah. Devorah is the Hebrew word for a bee, B-E-E, like a honeybee. And she died. She was the nurse to Rivka, to Rebecca. The Hebrew word here is meineket, and a nuk in Hebrew, which is kind of the root word here, is a suckling infant. So nurse here, like not in the sense of a medical nurse that, attended to the medical needs of Rivka, although I guess it could possibly include this. But this is a wet nurse. This is probably a servant girl who provided breast milk for Rivka's children, and she died. Now, when I read that, I thought, well, I wonder if Rivka is still alive. Now, this is kind of interesting. If we go over here to Finest Dake's Bible study notes on this verse, he says, Rivka's nurse died. And he says, nothing has been said of Rivka since Genesis 27:46, which is where Rivka says to Isaac, I'm weary of life because of the daughters of Heth, the Canaanite girls in the neighborhood. If Yaakov takes a wife of the daughters of Heth, these are those who are the daughters of the land. What good will my life be? So, in other words, Rivka is saying, if Yaakov marries a Canaanite girl, my life, has lost all of its meaning to me. And those are the last words, I believe those are the last words spoken by Rebecca. So I looked it up, and there is no mention of the death of Rebecca, in the Bible. And I know Chuck Missler in his Bible studies says that there are a lot of Gentile women in the stories leading up to the Messiah. Lots of Gentile women. Rivka would not be a Gentile woman because she's of the extended family. But let's see, who else do we have? Tamar. We have Ruth. We have Bathsheba, who may or may not have been a Gentile. But one of the things that Chuck Missler says is whenever you have Gentiles who play a positive role in the biblical story of redemption, the death of those Gentiles is never mentioned. So by saying that in connection with Rivka, I don't know if he's trying to suggest that Rivka is a Gentile. Although she comes from one of the other sons of Terah. So I guess she would be a Gentile, wouldn't she? She's of the same extended family as Abraham, but Abraham is the first generation of the promised family, of the chosen people. and Rivka came from one of his brothers. So even though she came from the same family as Abraham, it's a it's a different branch of the family tree. So I guess technically she would be considered a Gentile. And he says the Gentiles' deaths are never mentioned. And then he connects that fact. And by the way, I haven't researched this to find out if that's actually true. I kind of take his word for it. But then he says the reason for that is because the church, which is the believers in Jesus Christ, made up of both Jews and Gentiles, he says their destiny is not death, but it's heaven. So he makes a connection between this and the rapture of the church. So he says, because the church is largely made up of Gentiles, those Gentiles don't die. They just get transformed in the rapture and go to heaven. Now, I will be the first to admit that that is not the strongest of links between things that the Bible doesn't specifically say, but it kind of hints at. That's what Hebrews would call a remez. They'd call it a remez, a hint at something. So, like I say, there are various steps here that Missler makes, and he kind of connects those and brings them to the rapture. He may be absolutely right. Like I say, I haven't checked it out. And Chuck passed away a few years ago, and so he's not here to defend himself. So I'm not criticizing him. I'm just bringing up an interesting theory or speculation that he had. Now, by saying that these Gentiles that are mentioned positively in the Bible in connection with redemption, that they don't die, he's very he's very quick to explain that he's not suggesting that they didn't die physically. He's just saying their deaths aren't mentioned, whereas the death of Abraham and Sarah and Isaac and Rachel are mentioned. So the deaths of the Jews, their deaths are mentioned, their burials are mentioned, but the Gentiles, according to Chuck, are not. So just an interesting thing. Keep it in mind as we go through the rest of our studies and see what you think. Maybe you might want to do your own research. So now Devorah, Rivka's nurse, died, and she was buried below Bet El under a terebinth tree. So here again, we have digging under the terebinth or the oak trees and burying stuff. In this case, it's Devorah. That's where her burial was done. He did a similar thing with the false gods, with the false gods from uh, up in Shechem before they came to Bethel. So, there again, I don't know if there's any connection between idols and then maybe Devorah, since she came from that other branch of the family tree, may have been an idol worshiper. We know that Rachel was, because she took those images for herself. So, this may be another example of that. So the name of it, the place, was called Alon Bakut. Alon is the Hebrew word for a oak tree or a terebinth tree. Here, instead of Allah, which would be Aleph, Lamed, and Hey, it's Aleph, Lamed, and Noon. And I think this is a way, I think this is called a paragogic noon, and it's a way of uh, connecting this with, I'm sorry, here's alone. Connecting the word alone with the following word bakut. Baka in Hebrew means to weep or to cry. So I think this, our information window down at the bottom of the page here does say this is a construct. So I think that's the significance of the noon, the in at the end of the word alone. I think it makes it a construct, which means the oaks of weeping, of bakut. So Alon Bakut means the oaks of weeping, because Devorah died there. Verse 9, then God appeared to Yaakov again when he came from Padan Aram and blessed him. So this is a third appearance there at Bethel, which Yaakov was anticipating. And God said to him, your name is Yaakov. Your name shall not be called, your name is Yaakov. Your name shall not be called Yaakov anymore, but Israel shall be your name. So he called his name Israel. Now, verse 10 could be like Back to the Future. It could be like a recollection of what had happened when Yaakov came back to the land of Canaan from Padan Aram, from the extended family estate. He came back to Machanaim, and there is where the wrestling match was. And is that Genesis 32, I think, the wrestling match? That's where Yaakov's name is changed. And here in chapter 35, God is saying to him, your name is Yaakov, and he changes his name to Israel. So this may be happening in Bethel, and God is just reminding him that his name has already been changed to that. Or this may be like a flashback in the Bible, just reminding us that at Machanaim, a different place, is where his name was changed. And I'm not sure which is right. Also, Elohim said to him, I am let me get the Hebrew up here so you can see it. I am El Shaddai. So if we go over here, El is just a shortened form of Elohim. That makes sense. Nobody has any problems with that. Shaddai is interesting. This may be the first time this name is mentioned. I think it's mentioned prior, but it may not be. Anyway, Shaddai is translated Almighty. The interesting thing is that this root word here, Shaddai, is also a Hebrew word that is used for how shall I put this delicately, a nursing breast, a female's nursing breast, which if there's any connection to God, it's odd because God is constantly referred to in the male gender. So why would he be called a God with a nursing breast? It could be a way of saying that El Shaddai is our God and he cares for us, his children. He feeds us not with mother's milk, but with his word, as a mother would do. I don't think there's any gender confusion here. And those who use this to claim that God is actually female in gender, this is not the best argument for that, but even the better argument falls short. So El Shaddai may mean the God of the nursing breast. It's also a word like for powerful mountains. And that's why, okay, let me make a connection here. Let me make a kind of a visual connection. If you look on the horizon, and on the horizon, you see two mountaintops that rise above the horizon. That could be called Shaddai. And because mountains are equated with power, with earthquakes and, the source of rivers and stuff like that, that could be the reference to Shaddai. But if you use your imagination a little bit, you could say, well, that looks like a woman's breasts, two mountaintops like that. So there could be kind of a connection, and Hebrew words are like that. Shaddai can mean a woman's breast and a powerful mountain, or it can just mean the concept of strength and power and being almighty. So just to throw a little word out at you there, and you can make of that what you want. So God says, I am God Almighty, El Shaddai. Be fruitful and multiply. Now, this is a command that was given to Adam and Eve. And like every generation of humans, God wants human beings to make more human beings by the kind of the natural law of reproduction, men and women doing what men and women do to make babies. And that's God's idea. And he's, even, this would be like about 2,000 years before Christ. He still wants people making more babies. He makes a promise to Yaakov, a nation, a goy. Um, Goy is often a term that the Bible uses with reference to Gentiles, but it's actually the Hebrew word for any nation, including the chosen nation. So, I mean, the Jewish people in Israel are a Goy. They just happen to be the chosen one. And in practical use, Goy is usually used of Gentile nations. And also a company, a kahal. Kahal actually means like an assembly. This is the word for a congregation. We usually think of Christian congregations, which would be like a church building where people meet. The people who meet in that building are called a congregation. Synagogues are often called kehilot, or from the same root word kahal. But the church is called a kahal. The biblical term would be Kehilat HaNotzrim, the assembly of the Nazarenes, because the church, the followers of Yeshua, the born again believers in Yeshua, were called Nazarenes before they were called Christians. I think the first use of Christians is in Acts chapter 11, and it was not used in a complimentary way there. Christian means little Christ. But Kahal Hanotzim, Kelot Hanotzim, or Kehilat Hanotzim, is the assembly of the Nazarenes. So the promised family, the chosen people, are called not only a nation, but a congregation or an assembly, a company of nations. So not only are the people who believe in Yeshua, not only are they a congregation, but the nations uh, who are assembled in faith are also called a kahal. So a company of nations. And see, this is talking about redemption through the Messiah, Yeshua, coming not only to the Jewish people, but also to all the nations of the world. And when they become believers, they're all one big happy family. Well, what family is it? Is it the Gentile church, or is it the Messianic believers within the nation of Israel? And if you read Paul's teaching on the olive trees in Romans chapter 11, you realize that if you're a Gentile and you become a believer in Yeshua, the Messiah of the Savior of the whole world, then you become an Israeli. You become a Jew. You are grafted into the tree of Israel. So some Gentiles are not happy to hear that, because the church has a history of anti-Semitism, of hatred of the Jews. And wow, we are so, as I'm recording this, there's a war going on in Gaza after an atrocity was committed on October 7th of 2023. And basically, the whole world has turned against Israel. The whole world is acting anti-Semitically, I guess you would call it. But a lot of the people who are doing that anti-Semitism call themselves Christians, so they're hating their own people. Okay. Anyway, less politics here and more Bible. A nation and a company of nations shall proceed from you. So this is talking, ultimately, this is talking about the church. And the kingdom of God, the kingdom of, the kingdom of God, shall proceed from you, and kings shall come from your body. So Yaakov is the father of Yehuda or Judah, from which the kings of Israel were to come. But I think it extends beyond this. I think it is saying that believers from Gentile countries, many of them will be Christians, and so kings of Gentile countries will come from the Messiah in that sense of having been grafted into the olive tree of Israel and Judaism. Okay. Verse 12, the land which I gave Abraham and Yitzhak, I give to you and to your descendants after you. I give this land. So God chose to give this promised land, and we defined it before, from the river of Egypt to the great river Euphrates. He chose to give it to Abraham, not to his brother Nahor, and not to his brother Haran. He gave it to Abraham. And Abraham had at least two sons, Isaac and Ishmael. It was not given to Ishmael. Ishmael got a blessing from God, but the chosen son, Isaac, received the land and not his brother. Now, Isaac had two prominent sons, Yaakov and Esav. Esav was the oldest. You would expect him to get the promised land, but he didn't get it because he wasn't a man of faith. And Yaakov, whether he was a dirty rat or not, whether he was a dirty rat or a Tom, a upright, holy man, was God's choice because he was a man of faith. And so Yaakov gets it and Esav doesn't. I give to you and your descendants after you, I give this land. So we have the possession of the promised land settled for 3 generations, Abraham, Yitzhak, and Yaakov, and the descendants of Yaakov. Let's see. Then God went up from him in the place where he talked with him. So God appeared to Yaakov in Bethel. And after he had this conversation, and after he extended the Abrahamic covenant to Yaakov for his generation, and then he will extend it to the next generation as well, then God just ascended into heaven. Maybe Yaakov saw the ascent, maybe he didn't, but he went up from him. Let's see, the Hebrew word is Allah. Not to be confused with the name of the God of Islam. This is the Hebrew word that means to go up. So remember, when you're meeting with God, you go up. God lives in heaven, in the third heaven, which is up from here. Maybe way up from here, maybe closer than we think. So God went up from Bethel, where he talked with him. So Yaakov set up a pillar, a matzeva, which is a pillar, probably a pile of stone is what that was. I doubt if it was a lathed pillar or something like that. So he set up a pillar in the place where he, with a capital H, God had talked with him, a pillar of stone. See, I was right, but not a carved stone, like a stack of stone. And he poured a drink offering upon it. Now, when sacrifices were made in biblical times, of course, this wasn't It wasn't legislated until the law of Moses. Once the law of Moses came into being, then God's people knew exactly how they were supposed to sacrifice to him, what kind of animals, what kinds of things were acceptable. So most of the sacrifices focus on animals as a substitute for man. Those substitute animals shed their blood in the place of man, and then by faith, man receives the benefit of the shedding of that blood, so he doesn't have to shed his own sinful blood. So animals were sacrificed. Also, Grains were sacrificed, and it could either be a handful of grain or grain that had been baked into a loaf of bread. Usually not leavened bread. It was usually unleavened bread. There's one offering even in the law of Moses that involves leavened bread. But that's a grain offering or a meal offering, it's sometimes called, or just a bread offering. And those two, the animal sacrifice and the grain offering, were usually accompanied by uh, a drink offering of wine. And the drink offering here is called a nesek, which means a libation. It's usually wine that was offered with the animal flesh and the grain, and then wine was poured onto it. I think a hin is like a measure of it. And oil, shemen, was also added to these sacrifices. So you got animal flesh, grain, wine, and oil are all part of the sacrifices there. Then verse 15, and Yaakov called the name of the place where God spoke with him Bethel. He had called it that before. And again, this could be a flashback where it's remembering that Yaakov had called this place Bethel before, or he may be renewing the name of the place, because the Canaanites probably still called it Luz. Then they journeyed from Bethel, and when there was but a little distance to go to Ephrat. Now, I have to take exception to the New King James Version calling this place Ephrat, because if you look over in the Hebrew version here, it is called Ephrata with a feminine ending, not Ephrat. And it's spelled in the Hebrew with the H, so I don't know why the H is left off. I don't know why the Hey is left off, but it's Ephrata. And there Rachel labored in childbirth. The word childbirth is not in the text, but labor, teled, is it's a Hebrew word for giving birth. So obviously this is a reference to childbirth. And she had a hard labor, balidata, hard labor. Now it came to pass when she was in hard labor that the midwife said to her, Mayedet, Mayalet is the Hebrew word for that. And it's someone who helps a birthing mother, Mayalet. The midwife said to her, do not fear, you will have this son also. Probably the baby was breech. But the midwife, the midwife has probably ministered in such a way that the baby is going to be born. Maybe she was able to turn the baby. Maybe she was able to do a breech delivery. She assures Rachel that she will have, this child is coming out. And I think Dake makes the comment that cesarean section procedures were not available in these days. So this is a good report. The child is going to be born. It is a son. And so it was. So the child was born. But as it was happening, so it was, as the child was being born, her soul, Rachel's soul, was departing. She was dying, for she died. As her soul was departing, but sate nafsha means like in the process. This is not a completed action. She hadn't already died, but she was dying because of the hard labor, because of the difficulty of the childbirth. That she called his name, the child's name, Ben Oni. Ben means son of, Oni means my pain or my suffering. It can also mean mourning, as we see down below in the information window, son of my mourning. But his father called him Bin Yamin. Ben again means son of. Yamin means my right hand, um, which usually means something like this son is going to be very useful to me. He'll be like he'll be like my right hand. He'll like carry on my work for me, or he will assist me in my work, things like that. So Rachel dies. Uh, Rachel died and was buried on the way to Ephrat. Ephrata says our Hebrew Bible. That is Bethlehem. Now, here, we assume Moses is writing this. It's possible that the words that is Bethlehem were added by a scribe later on, but it seems that uh, Ephrat in Hebrew means like a fruitful place. It seems like it was already, even in the days of Moses, even in the days of Jacob and Rachel, that it was known as Bethlehem. So I'm not sure what to make of that. Um, I don't like to say that scribes added things to the text because knowing Jewish scribes, as I do, I mean, knowing by their practices, they were very hesitant to make any changes to the consonantal text of the Hebrew Bible. They make notes in the margins where they think the pronunciation should be different. Like Ephrat, if that's what it said in the Hebrew text and they thought it should be Ephratah, they wouldn't change it in the text. They would change it in the margin and say there should be a hey on the end of that. So I don't think this is an addition, but I don't know if the place was called Bethlehem at the time of Jacob and Rachel, or if it was called Bethlehem later in the days of Moses, and that Moses wrote that. Those are the two options that I like better. So that's where Rachel died, and I showed you a picture of the Kavar Rachel, the burial place of Rachel. And Yaakov set a pillar on her grave, another matzeva, a pile of stones, which is the pillar of Rachel's grave to this day. Now, one kind of interesting thing here, I think we've got enough time to do this. If you visit Israel, especially around Jerusalem, Jerusalem is just kind of surrounded by graveyards, especially on the east side of the old city of Jerusalem. The hillside, like going up the Mount of Olives to the east, is just covered with grave markers. Most of the grave markers are above ground, maybe a foot or 2 feet above ground, and then they have like a concrete or a stone slab on the top, and that's where the grave marker is. And most people of a Christian, like a Western Christian culture, when they go to a gravesite, they will leave flowers on the tomb, which I think is perfectly appropriate. But when Jews go to a gravesite like that, they put stones. Like they'll put a stone or several smaller stones on top of the gravesite. And I'm not sure why that tradition is, but one thing I've heard is that stones are permanent. Like if you put flowers on a grave, in a couple of weeks, they'll all be wilted and dead. But if you put a stone on there, that stone is going to look like that stone for generations and centuries and millennia. So it's a more permanent, a more eternal uh, kind of memorial for a grave. Okay, verse 21. Then Israel, he's been called Yaakov right up to this point. Now he's being called Israel. Now, the theory is, this is not my theory, it's one I've heard, that when Jacob is kind of being a goof and maybe kind of a bad guy, he's called Yaakov. But when he is shown to be a man of faith, then he is called Israel. So here he's called Israel. Then Israel journeyed, that's probably Nassau, pulled up his tent stakes and pitched his tent. Natah means to like stretch out or spread out. His tent, his ohel, beyond the Tower of Adair. Adair is a place name. It is also the name. It's a similar word to kahal, which is an assembly, or you could call it a flock. An Adair is a flock. So I told you before that a lot of synagogues are called kehilot, or assemblies. They're also called ederot. Adair is a flock. So Jewish people consider themselves the sheep of God's flock. Like Psalm 100 talks about his people, about believers, as the flock of his herd or his sheep. And then tower is migdal, which is the typical word for tower. Now, this is a special place. When this story was going on, when chapter 35 was going on, Jerusalem was not called Jerusalem. I don't think it was. The Jebusites, did the Jebusites live there, or was it just Canaanites? Anyway, at this early time, of course, the mountaintop was there, but there was no city of Jerusalem and no temple there. But to the south, near Bethel, near Ephratah, the fruitful place, was a place called Migdal Eder, which is the flock of the tower. And that is the place where in Jesus' day, I know this is true in Jesus' day, and it may date like way back into Old Testament history. This was the place where the shepherds raised the sheep that would be used in the sacrifices in the temple. So it was just a short distance away, probably less than 5 miles away. And the shepherds had the unique privilege and duty to raise sufficient sheep at Migdal Eder to be offered in the temple courts. And of course, as the population grew and as the city of Jerusalem grew, that would be a big number of sheep. But these sheep were not ordinary sheep. They couldn't be used for other sheep purposes. These were temple sacrifice sheep. So some interesting stories are told about Migdal Eder, the place where the sacrificial sheep were raised. Maybe goats too, because goats were an acceptable sacrifice. Verse 22, and it happened when Israel dwelt in the land that Reuven, and Reuben is the oldest son of Leah. Reuven went and lay with Bilhah, his father's concubine. And Israel heard about it. Jacob heard about it. Now, I need to flash back briefly, momentarily, to our PowerPoint. And see, he slept with Bilhah, which is Rachel's maidservant. So Reuben slept with Bilhah. Bad idea, right? Okay, we'll go back to our text. Reuben slept with Bilhah. It wasn't his own mom's concubine. What's the word for concubine here? Pilgesh. I'm sorry, Pilegesh. Pilegesh. And concubine is the only thing given. I think in other places they're called maidservants. Shifachot, I think would be the Hebrew for that. But here it's Pilegesh, which apparently is a concubine, which is kind of a wife and kind of not a wife. I think it's the kind of a wife who sleeps with the husband, but doesn't have the privileges of the other wives. So think about that. And Israel heard about it and probably was not very happy about it, as we'll see when the sons are blessed. So one of the reasons that Reuben will not get as blessing as he potentially could have got is because of this. He dishonored his father. And of course, he had an inappropriate sexual relationship with a woman who's probably a generation older than him, and he has no right to her. So this is fornication on his part. Now, the sons of Yaakov were 12. The sons of Leah were Reuven, Yaakov's firstborn, and Shimon, Simeon, Levi, Yehuda, or Judah. Now, the actual pronunciation of this Hebrew word is Isaskar. There are two sheens here. I'm sorry, two scenes here. So you got an ISSCR. And that should, even with the vowels, it should be pronounced Isaskar. But the typical pronunciation of this is Issachar. And actually, this first scene is doubled and then another one added on. So in effect, in the pronunciation, there should be three S's. Issachar. But typically it's pronounced Issachar. That's the standard pronunciation. And this may be one of those things that in the Hebrew Bible, it's just understood. Kind of like when you come across the consonants Yud He Vav He, which is the sacred name of God. You don't pronounce the vowels that are there. You just, like the wrong vowels are there to remind you that you should say Adonai instead of the sacred name of God, Yahweh. So this may be one of those, just everybody understood that you're supposed to drop off one or some of those S's. And then Zvulun. The sons of Rachel were Yosef and Binyamin. The sons of Bilhah, Rachel's maidservant, were Dan and Naphtali. And this was the concubine that Reuven slept with. And the sons of Zilpah, Leah's maidservant, were Gad and Asher. These were the sons of Yaakov who were born to him in Padan Aram. Then Yaakov came to his father Yitzhak at Mamre. And I don't know if the age is given here. We'll read on. I even questioned if Isaac was still alive at this point because, I mean, we're into the generation of Jacob, Isaac's son. Jacob's sons are full-grown men and they're married and they have kids and stuff. So he came to his father Yitzhak at Mamre, or Kiryat Arba, which is this word Arba. I think it has to do with four, the number four. Kiryat is like a village or something like that. So it's like four villages or a quarter of the village or something like that, where Abraham and Yitzhak had dwelt. This is Hebron, modern day Hebron. Now the days of Yitzhak were 180 years, so he lived a good long lifetime. Now remember when Yitzhak was much younger than this, when at least Yaakov didn't have any kids. Isaac was pretty old at that point, but he thought he was on his deathbed. And so he wants his son, Esav, to go hunting and cook him his favorite meals, like so he can die. And then, then the trickery comes about with Jacob ending up getting the blessing as well as the birthright and so forth. But Isaac thought he was dying then. That's before Yaakov had any kids. So Yaakov leaves because of that incident. He's in Haran for 20 years. So Isaac lived for at least 20 years after that, and maybe more so, because Jacob's, all but Benjamin, were born in Padan Aram. So now they're grown men. So are we talking 50 years later? 40 or 50 years later? So Isaac thought he was dying, and he lived like at least 40 years after that, um, before he died. Or going back to our thing about, was Jacob a Tom, an upright man or not? Maybe Isaac was just putting on a charade. Maybe he wanted this event to happen so he could bless the son, the younger son, Yaakov, who God had already announced would be the blessed son, would be the chosen son, even before the kids were born. So maybe Isaac was just going along with it and saying he was dying, but he wasn't really. Well, anyway, verse 29, he dies now. So Yitzhak died, breathed his last and died, and was gathered to his people. Now, this is the way they talk about dying. Um, in other words, Isaac will be taken to be reunited with loved ones of the faith who had died before he did. So this is an affirmation of life after death. It was no mystery to the patriarchs, no mystery to the chosen people, that after you died physically and your soul and your spirit came out. Remember when Rachel was dying in childbirth, the Bible says her soul was coming out of her. That's what happens when we die. The soul and spirit come out of the body. Then the body is buried, but the soul and spirit live on. Now, in the Old Testament days, before Yeshua died on the cross and descended into hell and gathered the captives from the underworld in a place sometimes called by the Bible Abraham's bosom, the place where the believers were gathered together. And then Yeshua took them to the third heaven, to paradise in heaven, to the Father's house with many mansions, where they are now. So in Old Testament days, when people died like this, when Rachel died and when Yitzhak died, their souls and spirits went to the underworld, where they were gathered with previous generations of believers. Now, in the same underworld called Sheol, there was a place called torments. And the most vivid description of this is in Luke 16, and probably around verse 30 or 35, maybe 40. The story of the rich man and Lazarus is told. The rich man was an unbeliever. Lazarus was a poor beggar, but he was a believer. They both died in close proximity to each other. They both went to Sheol in the underworld, but they went to different compartments. The rich man was in torments. We would call it hell. And the poor beggar, Lazarus, the believer, was in Abraham's bosom. So that's where people went. So Isaac dies, Rachel dies, but they go to the underworld, to Sheol, to Abraham's bosom, to be gathered to loved ones, to be reunited with loved ones. And they wait there for like 2,000 years until Yeshua descends into hell, and then they get to go to heaven. But this is definitely an affirmation of belief in life after death and eternal life for believers. Now, unbelievers have eternal existence. They live on, but they live on separated from God. They don't get to go to the Father's house with many mansions. So he was gathered to his people, those who had died before him, being old and full of days. And his sons, Esav and Yaakov, buried him. So the two sons, Yaakov and Esau, have already overcome all their differences, but now their father has died, and they come together for the funeral and are kind of united in their grief. And I think the hope and expectation that they will be reunited with him. I don't know what Esau's spiritual condition is. If he's an unbeliever, he doesn't have that hope of being reunited with believing loved ones. So I don't know. There's always hope that Esau came around and was a believer in Yahweh and believed in salvation through the Messiah and so forth. So that brings us to the end of our chapter and the end of our hour and 34 minutes. Sorry, we went a little bit long. Let me give you the Old Testament blessing, and I will speak the sacred name over you because I think it's appropriate from that context of Scripture to do this. Yivarechecha Yahweh vayishmarecha, Ya'er Yahweh panav elecha v'yuhunecha, Isa Yahweh panav elecha v'yasem lecha shalom. The Lord bless you and keep you. The Lord make his face shine upon you and be gracious to you. The Lord lift up his countenance upon you and give you peace. Shalom, dear friends. Hope we'll see you next time for Genesis 36.